You're right, my friends. Rather than breaking it apart and losing the soul in every curve of that massive text, we shouldn't go through it piece by piece. Since you said, don't shorten it, let it remain as it is. Then let's feel this magnificent saga stretching from 1972 to today, deep in our bones, weaving our sincerity and interpretations into it. Without disturbing that profound atmosphere, here is the full version of that long, solemn, and staggering journey. In 1972, a human being walked on the surface of the moon for the last time, my friends. More than half a century has passed since then. To put it simply, over 50 years of abandonment. Those boot prints left on those gray plains that resemble an ocean remain as perfect as they were on the first day in that absolute vacuum where there is no wind or rain. Just think, we grow old here. Cities are torn down and rebuilt, but there, time is as if frozen. Since that day, this blue planet we live on has become unrecognizable. We invented the internet, a global digital neural network. We decoded the startling cipher of the human genome. We even built reusable rockets that can be launched into space and land back on Earth, undamaged. Those massive technological wonders we watch landing with admiration. We placed a massive telescope like James Webb 1.5 million kilometers away from Earth, looking at the first moments of the universe, the dawn of time. However, my friends, since Gene Cernan climbed into his small, fragile capsule and left behind the silent dust of the moon, not a single human has set foot on that pale surface. The most common explanation for this long-term abandonment, perhaps the one we all want to believe, is simply that we lost interest in space. Yet the truth is much darker, much more disturbing, and much more complex than that. The secret behind why we haven't returned reveals the hidden mechanisms of how human civilization actually operates when it comes to achieving the most impossible things that push the boundaries. If you enjoy these kinds of calm journeys that change your perception of reality, my friends, you might consider supporting these deep explorations so they reach more curious minds, if you haven't already. Now, prepare yourselves. Set your mind free. We begin. There is a single sentence that has probably done more damage to our collective memory of space exploration than anything else. My friends. It's a sentence casually uttered at dinner tables, written with absolute confidence in internet environments, and repeated so many times over decades that it has solidified into an unquestioned truth. We already went to the moon. Weigh this sentence silently in your mind and listen to what it means, my friends. It uses the past tense, like a task that is finished and has a definitive line drawn through it on our civilization's to-do list. This simple sentence positions the moon as if it were an ordinary restaurant you visited years ago. It plants the illusion in minds that we went there, saw what it looked like, and can effortlessly go back whenever we want. Do you know, my friends? The most dangerous lies are the ones that contain a piece of truth within them. At the most superficial level, this statement certainly reflects a historical truth. Between July 1969 and December 1972, during 6 successful landing missions, 12 humans walked on that cold and silent surface where the sky is pitch black even during the day. They collected hundreds of kilograms of rock and soil samples, set up scientific instruments, and drove a wheeled vehicle over the gray dust that tells the violent history of our solar system. They took those unforgettable photographs etched into the memory of human history, and then returned home safely. The Apollo program achieved one of the most extraordinary engineering marvels our species has ever accomplished. This success is indisputable, my friends. No one can seriously question whether this happened or not. The real question that should keep us awake, the one that gnaws at our minds, is something else entirely. What did Apollo actually prove? Because hidden within that seemingly ordinary "we went" sentence is a very dangerous assumption, my friends. This assumption whispers that having gone to the moon once means going back should be relatively easy. We think we've cracked the cosmic code, solved the physics of giant rockets, and fully proven the engineering. We believe the hard part is long behind us, and all we need to do is summon a collective will to repeat this action. This massive fallacy derails every logical discussion about why humanity hasn't returned to that desolate surface for more than half a century, my friends. This mindset treats Apollo as if it were a permanent capability of our civilization, as if it were a neatly packaged technology we developed, tested, and can take off the shelf when the time comes. Like a magic recipe, perfected decades ago, that we just need to follow word for word today. Yet the truth is the complete and perfect opposite of this. My friends, to fully grasp this truth requires most people to tear out of their minds everything they think they know about how and why Apollo happened in the first place. My friends, we must slowly set aside that familiar mythology. We must silence the inspiring political speeches on black and white screens, those proud slow-motion images of giant rocket launches, and the enthusiastic orchestral music rising in the background. We must look at Apollo not as a flawless victory of humanity's desire to explore the universe, but as a product of very specific and extraordinary historical circumstances that will never come together again. My friends, Apollo was not a sustainable exploration program designed to open the moon for long-term use. It was a breathless sprint run at an incredible speed, an unbelievably expensive and one-time dash, the wildest scream our civilization ever let out. When we visualize the Apollo program in our minds, we usually see the victory of universal human curiosity. My friends, we tend to imagine it as a pinnacle reached by our civilization, a guarantee of our permanent place in the universe. Yet, when we strip away the gilded mythology, the remaining picture is much more jarring. Apollo was not a program designed to build a permanent space infrastructure. My friends, it was not a step taken with tranquility in the depths of space, but like a frantic dash toward the surface by a diver running out of oxygen, an incredibly complex, breathtakingly expensive, and completely unsustainable effort. You know how when you develop a technology, you assume it will stay with you permanently. We invented airplanes and the sky became ours. We found electricity and defeated the darkness. Out of this habit, we see going to the moon as a capability once earned and remaining with us forever. My friends, we imagine it as a neatly packaged box that has been successfully tested, approved, and can be used again when the time comes. The reality is exactly the opposite. My friends, space travel is not a soulless machine you can put in a drawer and forget, then take out and start whenever you feel like it. It is a living, complex organism that must be constantly fed. The Apollo program never aimed to turn the moon into a long-term settlement for humanity, my friends. There was no such plan on the engineers' tables. The fundamental task was very simple, very brutal, and incredibly dangerous: to land astronauts on that dusty surface, and, whatever the cost, keep them alive to bring them back to Earth within the narrowest time frame. The entire architecture of the mission was shaped according to this short and striking goal, my friends. Staying there permanently, establishing a sustainable life, or creating an independent system in space were complete luxuries. The only thing desired was to leave a footprint and depart immediately. This massive organization did not operate by the peacetime rules of a normal democratic society, my friends. Ordinary institutional oversight, budget constraints, and bureaucratic hurdles were temporarily eliminated entirely. The entire functioning of society and the state was locked onto a single focal point, as if facing an existential threat. There was no limit to the budget, no end hour for the shift. My friends, hundreds of thousands of people were working in giant factories and laboratories dedicated solely to this purpose. While test failures today would lead to investigations lasting years, back then they were analyzed within weeks, quickly corrected, and the journey continued. Time was like a ruthless hourglass. My friends, Apollo did not build a solid and permanent highway to the moon. Instead, it built a great bridge consisting only of political urgency and extraordinary budgets. And that legendary bridge was silently dismantled behind them the moment the last astronaut left the lunar surface and returned to their capsule. My friends, the pieces of that bridge could never be brought together again. You know how when you sprint, you don't save your energy for the future. You squeeze all your strength, all your breath into those seconds just to reach the goal of that moment. When you reach the goal, you have to stop, my friends. Because if you continue to run at that pace and with that adrenaline, the system collapses. Apollo was exactly like that, my friends. It reached the finish line, planted that famous flag, and then withdrew from the stage, breathless. Not because it failed, my friends, but on the contrary, because it successfully reached that singular and narrow goal it was designed for. But why, my friends? Why did humanity enter such a race that ruthlessly pushed its own limits, had no backup, and savagely consumed all resources, instead of a permanent and secure progression? Why did the brightest minds of our civilization at that time set aside all long-term logic and focus only on reaching there as soon as possible? What was that driving force that pushed us to break our ordinary rules and jump into the dark void without blinking? My friends, we must seek the answer to these questions not in the silence of the sky, but in the dark and tense periods of the earth. Because the thing that ignited this unique effort was not a pure desire like solving the mysteries of the universe. My friends, it was the work of a much deeper shadow, a heavy fear that shook an entire world. We must rewind time a bit to that darkest and most freezing winter of the Cold War. My friends, in the late 1950s, while the world was divided in two by an invisible wall, the United States believed its own technological superiority was an unshakable fact. It was the self-confidence of a country that had emerged from the World War as a global power, industrialized faster than any other nation in history, and built the atomic bomb. They assumed no rival could compete with their own engineering capacity. My friends. However, this deep and seemingly unshakable belief was shattered in a single night by a rhythmic and mechanical signal coming from the darkness of the sky. The date was October 4th, 1957, my friends. The Soviet Union had managed to place a small aluminum sphere into Earth's orbit. This satellite, named Sputnik, weighed only 83 kilograms. It carried no weapons, nor did it have the capacity to make advanced scientific measurements. All it did, my friends, while orbiting our planet every 96 minutes, was broadcast that monotonous, annoying signal that anyone with a shortwave radio receiver could hear. Beep, beep, beep. This extremely simple sound created a devastating psychological earthquake among the masses across the ocean. My friends, people who for thousands of years looked at the stars only to dream and find direction, that night looked at the sky and saw a silent threat patrolling above them. The reaction given by society was not calm or analytical, my friends. It was entirely instinctive and full of terror. Science curricula in schools were changed overnight from top to bottom. A crisis of confidence had spread to every level of society, my friends, because the logic lying behind it was extremely simple and terrifying. If the Soviet Union could defeat gravity and place an object in orbit, it could also drop a nuclear warhead on any point of the world, my friends. Sputnik was not just an innocent research satellite. It was a perfect show of force of intercontinental ballistic missile capacity. Disguised as a peaceful science cover, soon, the situation became even more suffocating. My friends, on April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to go into orbit. He completed a single orbit around the world in 108 minutes and returned safely to Earth. The United States, which had not yet achieved orbital spaceflight, had to watch this historic moment helplessly from the ground, my friends. The strategic consequences of this on the global chessboard were enormous. Developing countries were choosing sides in the Cold War. Technological success had now become the most definitive proof of ideological legitimacy. My friends, the message sent was easy, cold, and clear. The other side's system works, and the future belongs entirely to them. It was in this environment of geopolitical dread, not at the height of a universal curiosity, That President John F. Kennedy made that famous speech saying we will land a man on the moon before this decade is out. My friends, today, those words are remembered as one of the most inspiring moments in political history. Yet behind closed doors and in secret correspondence, the reality was very different, my friends. Leaders were not personally interested in the void of space or the geological structure of the moon. They understood the language of power, prestige, and global perception. The moon was exactly that untouched, massive stage that was needed, my friends. We must make this vital distinction. The Apollo program was not born from a desire to solve the mysteries of the universe, not from a pure admiration felt for the stars, but from an existential fear, my friends. A fear of ideological defeat. And this powerful fear allowed resources to be released immediately on a scale unparalleled in peacetime American history. My friends, the greatest engineering achievement of humanity was being built step by step, not in the light of our internal inspiration, but in the shadow of a dark thread in the sky, at its peak in 1966. The space agency was consuming about 4.5% of the entire federal budget alone. My friends, we need to ground the weight of this number in our minds a bit. Almost 5 cents of every dollar the government spent was flowing directly into piles of metal, to be launched into the void of space. When we adapt this figure to today's conditions, an astronomical budget of roughly $150 billion a year emerges. My friends, for comparison, the budget of the modern space agency is only a very small fraction of this figure. The Apollo era was receiving about 6 times the funding in real value that the modern agency receives today. My friends, this extraordinary resource obtained was not spent carefully or cautiously for the purpose of establishing a permanent space infrastructure. My friends, the speed of spending resembled exactly a wartime mobilization, because that was exactly what was happening behind the scenes. My friends, a bulletless, invisible ideological war, which if lost, would have devastating consequences. During the most heated days of the program, more than 400,000 people were working only on the moon mission. My friends, the most intense engineering intelligence humanity had ever seen up to that day was gathered around a single goal. However, behind this production miracle lay a superhuman price, my friends. The working culture had turned from a healthy routine into an obsession that pushed boundaries. A 70 or 80-hour workweek was not an exception, but an ordinary standard accepted by everyone. My friends, engineers were sleeping under their desks in their offices, unable to find the time to go home. The human mind and body were being tested relentlessly, along with the limits of metal and rocket fuel. My friends, that famous goal set was not a political inspiration or a sweet dream hoped to be reached in a distant future. My friends, it was a sharp, uncompromising, and functional deadline. The countdown clock was the absolute ruler of everything. The hardware emerging from this relentless environment of pressure pushed the limits of ambition and the human mind. So much that the splendor that emerged continues to deeply affect us even today, my friends. But the real truth behind this splendor was that it was the work of a life and death struggle, with no backup. The Saturn V rocket, my friends, a steel tower 110 meters tall that eclipsed even the Statue of Liberty with its base. Those 5 main engines fired at the moment of launch were producing an incredible thrust of 7.5 million pounds with a roar that shook the earth and sky. In just that brief moment you blink your eyes, tons of fuel were literally turning into a fireball. My friends, despite the half-century that has passed, it has not lost its title of being the most powerful launch vehicle ever flown to anyone. Reaching such absolute power in an age technologically much further behind us is proof of how uncompromisingly we pushed the laws of physics. My friends, but behind this magnificence lay a staggering design philosophy built on pure waste, completely contrary to the long-term logic of our civilization. My friends, every single part of the launched rockets was, without exception, concepts like reusing or refurbishing never found a place on the engineers' drawing boards. My friends, This technological marvel was designed not to serve humanity for decades, but to be completely destroyed in a single short mission, my friends. Every system fired meant a fortune of about $1.5 billion in today's money, burning and turning to ash in the sky within seconds. Throughout the Apollo missions alone, 13 fully equipped flight vehicles were fired toward the darkness of space, my friends. Each of these rockets was the product of the sleepless nights of hundreds of thousands of intelligent people. But the fate of all of them was sealed from the beginning. They would take off once, do the task assigned to them, and then either be buried in the dark depths of cold ocean waters or crash onto the dusty surface of the moon and be silenced forever. My friends, this ruthless philosophy of destruction perfectly exposes the hidden intention of the space program. My friends, the entire system architecture was shaped only to reach a single goal: to land the crew safely on that gray surface and bring them back home with the same speed. Returning there repeatedly or establishing a cost-effective transport line was never prioritized in any stage of this design. My friends, the only thing desired was to rip through that dark void just once, to carve the message "we achieved this" onto that pale dust for the other side, and then close the curtain and leave that stage. The main reason that has kept us imprisoned in our own orbit for half a century stands exactly in the heart of the consumerist understanding behind this crazy dash. My friends, the permanent steps of the future had been sacrificed for a moment of ostentation. The most ruthless example of those single-use systems designed was undoubtedly the landing module, also known as the Moon Spider. My friends, this small, strange-looking metal box was almost a monument to the savage simplicity reached by space engineering. The design philosophy was extremely sharp: to keep two humans alive on that alien surface for only 72 hours. The landing module carried exactly enough oxygen, water, and electricity for this short period, my friends. The reserves set aside as a margin of error were almost non-existent. There was a single ascent engine on the upper part of the vehicle to launch the astronauts back into lunar orbit. My friends, the most terrifying detail of the entire mission was hidden exactly in this engine. There was no backup for that single engine that would tear the crew away from the moon's gravity and start the journey home. My friends, no backup propulsion system, no secondary rocket. If that tiny ascent engine didn't fire, the astronauts would stay on that silent surface and die slowly. My friends, there was no rescue ship that could get them, nor a rescue operation plan. The system was so much on a knife's edge, my friends, that there was only one official procedure to be activated in case of a failure: a pre-written funeral ceremony text to be read by the President of the United States. A text exactly like this was waiting ready on the desk of the President of the period, Richard Nixon. My friends, fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These words were not a simple bureaucratic measure, my friends. They were the cold-blooded acceptance of a scenario the mission planners saw as extremely likely to happen. When we look from the meticulous safety standards of today's space agencies, it is almost impossible to understand this massive risk tolerance in the Apollo era, my friends. In those years, the probability of losing the crew was shown to be between 1 in 10. The astronauts themselves were fully aware of these deadly odds. My friends, they were former test pilots who throughout their professional lives saw strapping into experimental planes with a very high chance of falling as a routine job. They accepted the risk not for a simple show of courage, but as a reality inseparable from the nature of this mission, my friends. Not only the men inside those steel capsules, but an entire society had silently accepted these terrifying risks, because, my friends, the ruthless nature of the Cold War made this tolerance mandatory. The geopolitical devastation that losing the space race would bring was perceived as much heavier than the national mourning that losing a few astronauts would bring. My friends, this was the most critical fact that separated Apollo with a definitive line from all the space programs that came after it. Failing to reach the goal was seen as a much bigger disaster than the mission failing or people dying. My friends, however, the moment that historic mission was completed, everything changed, my friends. The moment Neil Armstrong's boot touched that fine dust, the political goal that was our reason for going to the moon was perfectly completed. The race was won. American technological superiority had been shown to the whole world, and when this great political goal was reached, the massive political will that fed it also evaporated almost instantly, my friends. Apollo missions 18, 19, and 20 were silently and quickly erased from the calendar. The reason lying behind this decision was not that the hardware was not available, my friends. The rockets to be used in those missions had already entered the production phase in the factories. The astronauts had received their training. Physically, we had the ability to continue going to the moon in our hands, my friends, but Congress refused to continue the funding of these missions. The moon had played its role on the Cold War competition stage, and it was no longer needed. My friends, a nation consciously chose not to do it while physically having the capability to continue flying to the moon. My friends, this decision requires us to completely reframe the question of returning to the moon. A hidden assumption lies within the question, why can't we go back now? We think something went wrong, that we lost a capability. Yet a more accurate framework turns the question around. My friends, the extraordinary thing is not that we stopped going to the moon, but that we went there in the first place. Apollo was not a rule, my friends, it was an anomaly. It was a short peak point created by the simultaneous alignment of a geopolitical crisis, an unlimited budget freedom, and an incredible risk tolerance, my friends. By 1970, that window had completely closed. When Apollo ended, everything collapsed, my friends. Saturn V production lines were completely shut down, special tools were dismantled, and many were directly scrapped. My friends, factories closed their shutters. Today, only 3 unused rockets remain from the Saturn V, and they are exhibited lying on their sides in museums. My friends, they are now objects preserved for historical reflection, not for operational use. You can't put fuel in a museum exhibit, my friends. The real destruction was not the loss of hardware, but the loss of the human infrastructure that created that hardware, my friends. When the Apollo program ended, those unique experts scattered. Welders went to shipyards, engineers moved to the computer industry. My friends, that collective genius that made Apollo possible thinned out and disappeared. Knowledge lives in muscle memory and professional intuition. My friends, it is transferred through apprenticeship, not through documents. When the Apollo workforce scattered, these transfer chains were broken. My friends, the space agency realized how deep this loss was in the 1990s. When it looked at the old plans, the plans were incomplete. Notes that were clear for a technician in 1966 were completely meaningless 30 years later. My friends, this is what the expression "we lost the technology" actually is. What was lost was the industrial ability to build rockets. My friends, after Apollo, the space shuttle era began. My friends, the shuttle was magnificent, but its ceiling was low Earth orbit. My friends, the place it could reach was 600 kilometers. The moon is 384,000 kilometers away. The shuttle was as far from the moon as a harbor ferry is from being able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. My friends, yet, for 30 years, it consumed the entire budget alone. Every dollar spent on shuttle operations was a dollar not spent on developing the next generation of deep space transportation. My friends, the real price of these 30 years spent with limited budgets is measured by what could not be done. My friends, deep space technology remained asleep. Moon suits waited on dusty shelves only as conceptual studies. The attempts made to break this cycle were always left halfway because of the short lifespan of political will, my friends. In 1989, Bush's initiative was stillborn due to financial reluctance. In 2004, the Constellation program started but was canceled in 2010, my friends. Every cancellation took with it the hope and expertise of thousands of engineers. Engineers became people who designed systems that would be cancelled instead of flying hardware. My friends, and this situation gave birth to an institutional caution. Now, my friends, we must stop seeing the more than 50 years of silence on the lunar surface as a failure. Apollo did not prove to us that humanity could live on the moon. It only proved that with extraordinary pressure and an unlimited budget, one could go there for a short time, my friends. The Apollo crew did not go there to establish infrastructure. They stayed for only 3 days and left immediately, my friends. We spent only 3 days in a world we spent $200 billion on. This situation can be compared to a mountain climb. There is a difference in kind, not in degree, between reaching the peak and planting a flag and establishing a permanent research station there. My friends, the modern moon programs we plan today can no longer operate with the minimum duration logic. My friends, in the past, there were open-loop systems that consumed oxygen and threw it away. But for a 28-day mission, these systems are impossible, my friends. You would need to carry tons of materials. Now we are working on closed-loop systems that constantly recycle air and water, my friends. There are systems on the space station that turn even urine into potable water, but when a part malfunctions on the lunar surface, it could take months for a spare part to come from Earth. My friends, this is the real engineering test, maintaining a self-sufficient mechanism on that distant world. There is more, my friends. Radiation and moon dust. The Apollo crew was lucky. My friends, the sun was calm. But in long-term stays, it is almost a certainty to be caught in those dangerous proton storms. My friends, to protect the crew, we have to pile meters of lunar soil on top of the living modules. Moon dust, on the other hand, is not like the sand on Earth, my friends. Because it is not eroded by wind, it is as sharp as shards of glass and sticks stubbornly to everything. My friends, Apollo astronauts got moon hay fever because that dust was seeping everywhere. We have to learn to protect our machines and our lungs from these microscopic razors, my friends. The south pole of the moon, that mysterious region, is our only realistic hope, my friends. There are peaks of eternal light there. Thanks to the sun that almost never sets, we can solve the energy problem, my friends. And inside those dark craters, billions of years of water ice are hidden, my friends. If we find water, we can survive. If we have water, it means we have fuel too, my friends. Producing fuel from the moon will change all the balances of the solar system, my friends. Today, not only states but also commercial companies are on the stage, my friends. This situation makes the program more resilient to political winds. Returning to the moon is no longer a dash, but a patient construction project, my friends. With the Artemis Accords, more than 40 nations have set their hearts on this path, my friends. When an administration says I've given up, it will now have to take all its allies against it, my friends. This diplomatic network makes the program's lifespan longer than elections. With China landing on the far side of the moon, a new competition has begun, my friends. This competition could be the spark that moves us, but my friends, our only goal should not be to win the race. A race ends and the heroes return. When a construction project ends, life begins, my friends. What we need is not a temporary victory, but a settlement that will stay there, my friends. Patience lies at the heart of this massive journey. Apollo proved our courage, but the 50 years that passed showed us that courage is not enough, my friends. An unshakable determination is required. The moon is waiting for us there solemnly, as it has been for billions of years, my friends. Now, let's slowly leave these deep thoughts to the edge of our minds, my friends. Imagine the silver-colored serene light of the moon filtering into your room. Feel everything slowing down, the noises falling silent, my friends. Let that peaceful darkness of space wrap around you like a blanket. We take a deep breath, my friends. With every breath we take, we distance ourselves from all the weight of the earth. Feel your body being pulled into the peace of the weightless void, my friends. Darkness is now a safe harbor. That ancient silence of the moon now becomes your silence, my friends. We are sliding into a billion-year-old peace. While the stars flicker like lanterns in the distance, we are resting in the safe lap of this universe, my friends. There is no need for us to hurry. Our goal will always be waiting for us there, my friends. But now is just the time to rest. May your mind continue to glide peacefully in those calm seas of the moon, my friends. Leave yourself to this infinite serenity. Good night.